Hello everyone, this is Colin once again. I'm doing this video after a year of not uploading anything, and the topic of this video in particular is a little discussion on hermeneutics, or the way that we as readers, when we approach sacred scripture or wisdom texts, or mythology, or really pretty much any text for that matter, but the focus will be on religion and religious scripture, how we come to an understanding of what we're reading. Anytime that humans pick up anything and we read it, we instantly start thinking to ourselves, what's the meaning of what we are reading? How do we understand it? And there are certain bodies of literature that cause people to meditate on what they are reading, or to really consider it. Philosophical texts, poetry, certain types of literature, scripture, metaphysical texts, all of these, you read it and it's very common for people to step back from what they're reading and consider, what is the application, what is being said, and how does this relate to us as people. Some people really care about this, some people really don't. And what I would like to do is talk about briefly the way in which Swedenborgians approach the understanding of Scripture. There are, within every major faith tradition, there are groups or scholars, whole denominations, sects, what have you, that favor a non-literal interpretation and understanding of Scripture as opposed to the literal apparent meaning of Scripture. That's something that we need to understand when we're looking at the history of religion, but more importantly, the history of hermeneutics, of understanding Scripture. In fact, one could argue that a non-literal reading of the text was actually the primary or the dominant understanding, or the understanding that Scripture had layers of meaning, all the way up until the present moment. It wasn't really until the modern movement of fundamentalist literalism, and of course the challenge to that perspective, the reductionist critical perspective, that they met each other on the battlefield of opinions, if you will, and their primary point of argument was the literal manifest reading of the text. Both sides typically, while they may acknowledge that some people do read Scripture allegorically, or metaphorically, or symbolically, they are not that interested in that subject. They go to the text and they only make arguments from the literal manifest reading of Scripture. One essay that I'd like to mention is called "Telling the Old Story Anew" by the Reverend Dr. James Lawrence, who is a Swedenborgian scholar and minister. This is an essay that he wrote to honor another Swedenborgian scholar, the Reverend Dr. George Dole, who was really huge and instrumental on a developmentalist hermeneutic of the Bible, essentially marrying a symbolic reading of the Bible with developmental psychology. In his essay, it is on page 76 of the book Principles in Play, which the essay is contained therein. On page 76, he writes, James Lawrence writes, first, I emphasize that for a tradition Swedenborgian that has inclined strongly towards what Roland Barthes would call a readerly text, George's Bible project produces a fertile and open-ended writerly text. So this is something that I'd like to mention. So this particular scholar, Roland Barthes, the footnote for this explains that he was a French philosopher influential in literary theory, whose work explored what it means to interpret a text. Okay. His philosophy of readerly and writerly approaches to interpretation is especially articulated in a particular text that he wrote in 1970. Okay. Continuing, I wish to borrow Barth's terminology because I find them excellent shortcuts to basic stances towards interpretation. The readerly text especially produces ready-made meaning of the text and a passive reception of the text's meaning, whereas the writerly text requires the reader to become a writer. to produce a new text in the critical act of interpreting for meaning into one's own context. A writerly text looks towards a deep and profoundly personal engagement with the text, and is only satisfied with interpretive act that achieves full ownership of the text in the sense of arriving at a new interpretation of oneself through dialogue with the text. Overall, I believe Swedenborgians have tended towards readerly interpretations of both Swedenborg and the Bible, though there is recent trend among a few Swedenborgians in all branches towards writerly texts. The following I will hope to illuminate what I mean. So, I want to pause there for a moment. So he goes on to talk about the difference between the readerly text and the writerly text. And I think that this is a very important thing to talk about here, because I think when I next go to Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith, and the part, the note that Harris has in his text that I would like to draw everyone's attention to, I think that this is something that Sam Harris, writing this book in 2005, and so I want to have a caution here, he could have evolved his stance since this point. But he represents, and his writing in this book in 2005 represents an attitude that I have come across from many people, particularly the literalist camp and the reductionist camp. And James Lawrence, in this particular essay, draws attention to the fact that, these two camps typically criticize the third camp, which is the more symbolic, allegorical understanding or approach to Scripture. So, it's no mistake that Sam Harris criticizes the symbolic understanding of Scripture, because he himself is a reductionist who attacks Scripture on the literal level. And so going back to this, what's the difference between the writerly and the readerly? The readerly is passive. So in other words, the readerly approach to symbolic understanding of Scripture is when you approach Scripture by seeing what people have commented on Scripture from the past. So in other words, if a Muslim goes to a tafsir, or if a Swedenborgian goes to the works of Emanuel Swedenborg to understand the symbolic, non-literal understanding of Genesis and Exodus, for example, or a Catholic reads the works of St. Augustine with regards to his non-literal interpretation of Genesis. Someone reads C.S. Lewis to understand how Lewis approached Scripture. That's a readerly approach to the text. The writerly approach is something that Sam Harris criticizes in The End of Faith. This is the only solid argument that he makes, in my opinion, against symbolic reading is when someone does the writerly approach. Again, to use Lawrence quoting the French philosopher Barthes, Harris does not mention the difference. Okay. Now, it's important to understand this because one could levy a criticism against the writerly approach. So when someone just picks up the Bible or picks up any Scripture and reads it and says, this is what I think it means, and makes an argument from that, someone could say, well, you're just one person interpreting the text. Why should I trust your interpretation? The difference is that the readerly approach becomes systematic. So you're going to see in a moment how Sam Harris criticizes someone like Joseph Campbell, and does so, and so what Sam Harris does is he conflates what we could say the writerly and the readerly approaches. He treats them as one and the same, which is a very common, I think, misconception against people who attack the allegorical understanding of Scripture, the psychosymbolic understanding of Scripture. They just typically look at it and they say, oh, well, they ignore the nuances. And again, I'm not necessarily attacking Sam Harris directly. I'm using Sam Harris's critique as an example of what I believe to be many people's mistake in approaching the subject. So you have one that becomes a systematic approach to Scripture. So, for example, if I want to understand what depth psychology says, what Jungian psychology says about religion, or about an understanding of Scripture, there's a whole host of literature on the subject of how Jungians, from Jung himself down to the 21st century, down to today, interpret Scripture. Okay? So it's not just some random person coming along and saying, I have this idea. It is something, it is a system that has evolved since a point of origin up to now. It has gone through evolution and revision and criticism and has changed. That is a system of interpretation. That is something that we see in all major world religions. When the Upanishads were written to make comments on Hindu thought, the Upanishads became a system of interpretation. When the Kabbalah or the Jewish scholars said that there were 4 major ways of understanding the Tanakh, that became a system of interpretation. Similarly, when mystical Christians interpret Scripture non-literally, that has become a systematic approach, arguably starting with Jesus himself when he talked about parables, or even St. Paul not taking Sarah and Hagar as symbols for something. That's as early as we can go back to a Christian system of non-literal interpretation, which was taken up by many early church fathers throughout the centuries. We go to Islam, you have the Quran speaking in parables, but then you have tafsirs that do interpret verses in a non-literal way, all the way down to the 21st century, people like Muhammad Asad and Abdul Yusuf Ali, who cited older medieval texts in their non-literal approach to Scripture. That is the readerly approach, as mentioned by Barth and James Lawrence in his essay. The writerly approach has an individual reading the Bible, the Quran, the Gita, and saying, this is what I think this means for me. It's not systematic, it's actually a very personal interpretation of what the person thinks the Scripture is saying. Having established that, let's now look at what Sam Harris says on page 296 of the paperback edition of The End of Faith. He says, he begins by talking about that many students of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition will claim that his literal reading of Scripture betrays my ignorance of their spiritual import. He goes on to say that to be sure, there have been occult, alchemical, and conventionally mystical interpretations of various passages in the Bible and the Quran, and these interpretations are as old as the texts themselves. But the problem with such hermeneutical efforts, whether it be the highly dubious theory of the letters of the Hebrew Torah meaning something individually, the numerical equivalent, or the glib symbol seeking of popular scholars like Joseph Campbell, is that they are perfectly unconstrained by the contents of the text themselves. What I think he's saying here is that the interpretations are not constrained by the text. In other words, you can read some passages or whole chapters or whole books of a scripture, and someone can come up with an interpretation that the text is not clearly indicating on the literal manifest level. That's what he is saying here. So he's not denying that these things have existed, but he is saying that they're problematic in that the text may not say, hey, look, here's this allegorical interpretation. Unless, of course, Jesus is saying, here's this parable, or the Quran says, have they not considered this story or this parable? He then says, one can interpret every text in such a way as to yield almost any mystical or occult instruction. He then, jokingly, gives an example where he quotes A Taste of Hawaii. It's a cookbook. And he has a recipe, and then he gives what he considers to be a spiritual interpretation of the line-by-line recipe. He then goes on to say on page 298 that such metaphorical acrobatics can be performed on almost any text, and that they are therefore meaningless, should be obvious. Okay, so he has one point of contention, that while he acknowledges that this type of interpretation has existed almost as old and dating back as almost to the writing of the text itself, he says that they are not constrained by the literal manifest reading. That's his first contention. His second contention is that because you can do this on literally any text, on almost any text, he says, and that they are therefore meaningless should be obvious. So because you can do this with anything, he is saying, almost anything, that is another problem that he has. He then says that the scripture almost comes like a Rorschach blot, whereas the occultist can find his magical principles perfectly reflected, the conventional mystic can find his recipe for transcendence, and the totalitarian dogmatist can hear God telling him to suppress the intelligence and creativity of others. That's only if you are giving credence to the writerly interpretation, style of interpretation, right? The personal interpretation. So I do agree that we have to be weary of people who are taking personal interpretation and trying to tell other people, this is how I see it, this is my personal interpretation, therefore you all need to look at it from my perspective. This is very different than a systematic approach, a system of interpretation which has been established through centuries of study of literature, of scripture. Okay? So I do think his critique is valid for saying, look, the personal interpretation can get kind of out there, because you can have people who are, again, the dogmatist who says, I read this passage and God tells me to do this. I do think he has a point in highlighting that. But he goes on to say, this is not to say that no author has ever coached spiritual mystical information in allegory, or even produced a text that requires a strenuous hermeneutical effort to be made sense of. So here he is saying, he's acknowledging that there are bodies of text that have been coached in spiritual mystical content that you need to study. You need strenuous hermeneutical effort to make sense of it. But earlier he mocked someone like Joseph Campbell, who looks at mythology and religion in this way, that underneath the manifest content there is this deeper mystical spiritual understanding that you need to basically you need to approach it from these very old systems of interpretation, whether it's Jewish, early church fathers for Christianity, tafsir literature for Islam, Sufi literature for Islam, etc. So he earlier mocks the idea that scripture can be approached this way. Again, on one hand he says that yes, this style has been here, but on the other hand he seems to be mocking it. Interesting enough, he then says, if you pick up a copy of Finnegans Wake, here we have a novel by James Joyce that he now brings forward. For instance, and if you imagine that you found therein allusions to various cosmogonic myths and alchemical schemes, chances are that you have, because Joyce put them there. But to drudge scripture in this manner and discover the occasional pearl is little more than a literary game, really. So on one hand, he says, oh, but if you pick up Finnegans Wake and you think you're reading it and you think you're finding some really profound things in there, that's because Joyce put it there. But to do it for scripture is just ridiculous. That's essentially what he's saying, that you might occasionally find occasional pearl in there, but it's a little more than a literary game. I find that fascinating. To me, that's not being... Sam Harris at this exact point is not being consistent. Because someone could read Finnegans Wake and come out of it and have said, oh, I didn't find anything about mythology or mysticism at all in Finnegans Wake. People could read a novel and say, I just didn't see anything to warrant a symbolic understanding of what I just read. While he gives Finnegans Wake as an example in literature, he's now saying that scripture, it's almost like a ridiculous game to play when it comes to scripture. Why? Because he conflates the systematic approach to understanding scripture. I know if I say objective, the objective approach, that might annoy some people, but it really is the objective approach. You approach scripture because you have a system of hermeneutics that's informing you of how to approach scripture. So for example, if I'm a Sufi Muslim and I take Rumi's Mathnawi, which is considered by many Mevlevi Sufis and other Muslims to be a mystical tafsir, to understand certain hadiths or to approach the Quran and other Islamic texts. If I'm a Mevlevi Sufi and I take Rumi in the Mathnawi as my systematic approach to understanding scripture, that's not my own personal opinion. I am taking a system of a tradition that has been in place for centuries, and I'm applying that when I'm keeping that in mind. I'm seeing through the lens of that hermeneutic approach to understand Scripture. So, as a Swedenborgian, if I'm going to approach the Bible, I'm going to look at it from the way Swedenborg understands Scripture, which again is not unique to Christianity or the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, because early church fathers, for centuries, interpreted many parts of the Bible in a non-literal way and gave their reasoning for it. And you find that many of them come to very similar conclusions when they're talking about this systematic allegorical approach. Similarly, if I want to approach Scripture or mythology like Joseph Campbell does, which is something that Sam Harris does not mention. He mentions Joseph Campbell in his note here. Joseph Campbell was not just pulling interpretation out of thin air. He states very clearly at his foundation, even as early as The Hero with a Thousand Faces, his first book, he clearly states that he is using anthropology, scholars from anthropology, sociology, but more importantly, depth psychology. He's using the understanding of Freud and Jung to understand what myth and religion, what Scripture and mythology, what they are saying, and how to understand them, how to interpret them. So it's not just pulling things out of anywhere. He's using a strict foundation of interpretation, Joseph Campbell. Not just go on a tirade about defending Joseph Campbell, but again, this is why I'm saying that the criticism I have of Sam Harris in this moment is he is creating. He's not being consistent by saying that you can take literature like Finnegans Wake and interpret it, and find allegory within, but yet he denies this for Scripture. Or at least he says that you can maybe find the occasional thing, but it's too much of a game, he says. He's not being consistent there. I also would like to point out a criticism that he's conflating the personal interpretation and the systematic interpretation of allegory. I also would like to point out that Joseph Campbell, even before Hero with a Thousand Faces, he became famous for another text, which he co-authored with Henry Morton Robinson. This is actually what pretty much put Campbell on the map as a scholar. He wanted to help people understand a certain novel, and how to interpret this novel. And he wanted to understand it from a symbolic perspective so that he could help people when reading this very complicated, very profound novel, that they wouldn't be overwhelmed by it. They could read it and understand it. The truths contained therein, the pearls, as Sam Harris might say. And to understand that the allegorical interpretation is a sophisticated approach. This is something that James Lawrence says in his essay, that not everyone is going to understand it. And in fact, many scholars who have made the mystical and allegorical interpretation a given throughout the centuries have said that this is not easy for everyone to do. Averroes, or Ibn Rushd, stated clearly in his writings that there is levels of interpretation because certain people just can't get past the literal reading. They can't even approach Scripture from the spiritual, the Sufi, or the philosophical perspective. It's just difficult for them. When we have examples of Jesus in the parables, Jesus gives these parables, and many of the crowd, including his own disciples at the time, are going, I don't understand. The Quran mentions parables and says that many people do not understand the parables. Some people just don't get it. But some people do get it, and they can approach Scripture in this way. But it is sophisticated. And that is why I think that it is difficult for some people to wrap their heads around it, because what's frankly easier is just to pop open the Torah or the Gita and just read it for what it says. And indeed, we have to do that with... Everyone has to do that. The manifest content is the starting point for everybody. But it becomes a sophisticated hermeneutic to understand that Scripture contains a deeper meaning. Now, some people may not think that it has a systematic, deeper meaning, but many people do. And therefore, you can't just brush it aside. For the literalists and the reductionists, critics, to fight each other over the literal meaning, that's why when those of us who are this third camp attempt to enter the fray, it's easier for them just to go, no, get out of here. We're not wanted, because it's not easy to attack this position, because you actually have to do your homework. Having said that, let's go back to Joseph Campbell, and this is where I'd like to end the video. As I said, Joseph Campbell became famous because of his work on one particular text, Now, what was the text? Because in A Hero with a Thousand Faces, he's talking about tons of mythology, tons of religion. What was the text that he created a book with that he co-authored with Morton Robertson to understand the symbolic understanding of this particular novel? What was it? It was Finnegans Wake. And he wrote the book called A Skeleton Key to Finnegans Wake, unlocking James Joyce's masterpiece. So I guess in this regard, Sam Harris and Joseph Campbell can come to some sort of an agreement. But what's more profound is that this is what started Joseph Campbell's career as a scholar, was to interpret the symbolism contained in Finnegans Wake. I would encourage everyone to give a closer look to this alternative way of understanding Scripture, because this debate raging between reductionists like Sam Harris and literal dogmatists and fundamentalists, they have arguments with each other all the time, and yet those of us who approach Scripture in this allegorical, psychological, spiritual fashion, we're not in that argument. But we need to be louder. We need to increase our volume of our voice in sharing this unique perspective of understanding mythology, literature, world religions, because this is something that keeps Scripture relevant and doesn't become stale with a dogmatic fundamentalist perspective, and it becomes more enriched. Something that does take study and nuance, and you know, it's not something that you just crack open a text and you suddenly understand it. It takes a lot of nuance and understanding. But I encourage everyone to look into this, and that's why I wanted to make this video. Thank you all for watching. Peace be with you all.